The year was 1831. The air over the borderland between Virginia and North Carolina was heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. A tenant farmer named Elias Moore was tilling a field that had only recently been cleared of its dense underbrush. His plow horse strained forward, hooves sinking into the soggy soil of the lowland meadow. Suddenly, the animal stumbled. Elias dismounted to investigate, assuming he had struck a tree root or the remains of an old well. What he uncovered would ignite whispers that had lurked in the region for decades. Beneath a layer of loose soil lay the rotting wood of a rectangular chest, its edges blackened by dampness. The farmer, fearing it might be an old storage box, pried it open. Inside, curled unnaturally within the confines of the box, were human remains. The bones had yellowed with age, yet the skull bore a clear fracture, as if struck by blunt force. The jawbone still clung to fragments of teeth, grim reminders of a once living man. Elias staggered back, sickened. He knew the land he rented had once belonged to a widow who inspired dread throughout the countryside, Margaret Harker. Word spread quickly through the small communities along the border. Within days, authorities descended on the field. Shovels struck earth, and more boxes were uncovered. In one, the skeleton of a child no more than 8 years old. In another, the remains of 2 individuals interred together, their bones twisted as if they had been forced inside while still clinging to life. In total, 7 bodies were unearthed before the digging ceased, but locals whispered of dozens more that had never been found. Each grave was a story erased, each box a coffin prepared not by grief, but by calculation. The discovery confirmed rumors that had haunted the borderland for decades. Farmers, merchants, and travelers alike had long spoken in hushed tones of a towering woman with a voice like thunder and a gaze sharp enough to curdle blood. Some claimed she trafficked in stolen children. Others whispered she was behind the disappearances of traders who rode south and never returned. Now, as the ground itself gave up its secrets, these suspicions coalesced into a terrifying certainty the Widow Harker had been more than a rumor. She had been death incarnate. To understand the horror that unfolded in those muddy fields, one must grasp the peculiar landscape of the region. In the early 19th century, this corner of Virginia was a true frontier, though not in the sense of open plains and westward expansion. Instead, it was a borderland of shifting jurisdictions. The county lines of Virginia and North Carolina overlapped with confusing precision. Sheriffs, when they existed at all, were limited by county authority. A criminal could step across a road or a river and evade pursuit. Swamps and Blackwater rivers offered concealment, while isolated farms ensured that cries for help would vanish into the night unheard. This environment had bred suspicion among its inhabitants. Families kept to themselves, wary of outsiders. Every tavern was a place of both refuge and danger. Along the winding Blackwater River, stories were told of barges that moved silently at night, laden with cargo that was not cotton or tobacco, but human beings. The discovery of the bodies in 1831 suggested those tales had been true all along. Investigators pieced together what they could. The remains bore signs of violence, broken ribs, shattered skulls, bones marked with cuts suggesting restraints had bitten into flesh. Some boxes had been deliberately crafted to human proportions, evidence of premeditation rather than desperate concealment. The fact that multiple children were found among the dead hinted at a ruthless practicality, the elimination of innocents who might otherwise bear witness. The sheriff of Southampton County, Thomas Redford, was shaken by what he saw. "It is not only the act of killing," he wrote in his ledger, "but the manner of it. These were not hasty burials born of passion. These were contrivances of industry, murder as a trade." His words captured the essence of what was becoming clear. This was no crime of impulse. It was the evidence of a system, a network designed to profit from human misery. At the center of these whispers stood one figure, Margaret Harker, often called simply the Widow. She had lived in the region for decades, arriving in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War with little traceable past. Tall, nearly 6 feet. An extraordinary stature for a woman of her time, she possessed a physical presence that unsettled men and women alike. Those who recalled her spoke of her strength, of her booming voice, and of her uncanny ability to command silence in a crowded room. Some neighbors avoided her entirely. Others traded with her reluctantly. Few dared accuse her directly, for to cross her was to court misfortune. Her homestead, a modest 2-story dwelling near the border, had long been rumored to conceal hidden chambers. Children told tales of muffled cries that echoed at night, of wagons arriving under cover of darkness and leaving before dawn. Most dismissed these stories as superstition until Elias Moore's plow horse stumbled on that buried chest. What had once been rumor now became undeniable fact. The remains unearthed in 1831 marked only the beginning of the unraveling. As news spread, more voices emerged. Families from as far north as Philadelphia began recalling missing relatives who had vanished after passing through the borderland. A blacksmith swore he had seen strange chains delivered to Harker's property. A ferryman remembered carrying her wagons across the river, their cargo covered too carefully to be mere goods. Each testimony added weight to the picture of a criminal enterprise both vast and cruel. Yet, even in the face of these revelations, there was resistance. Many white settlers in the region had long benefited from silence. Free black men and women disappeared often, and their absence rarely provoked official concern. To speak against Harker was to invite danger, and so for years the community had collectively chosen to look away. Only when the earth forced the truth into the open did the facade crumble. The discovery in that lonely field was more than the unearthing of bodies. It was the exposure of an entire shadow world operating parallel to the law. A world in which human lives were bartered and discarded, where children's cries were stifled beneath soil and timber, and where a woman known only as the Widow reigned through terror and greed. It was a revelation that would shake Virginia to its core, drawing the eyes of officials far beyond the county line. The reign of Margaret Harker was no longer a whispered tale. It had become an undeniable chapter of America's darkest history. Margaret Harker's name was spoken in whispers long before her crimes were unearthed, among the border communities of Virginia and North Carolina. She was not merely a woman, but a looming presence, a shadow that lingered at crossroads and tavern benches long after her departure. Locals called her simply the Widow. For decades, that title alone carried weight, a warning to children who wandered too far from home, a hush that settled over gatherings when her figure appeared on the horizon. Born sometime in the final decades of the 18th century, Margaret's origins were deliberately obscured. Some said she came from New England, arriving after the turmoil of the Revolutionary War. Others believed she had been born in a small hamlet near Boston, though no reliable records survive. She herself encouraged the uncertainty, spinning contradictory tales of a seafaring father or a French immigrant mother, depending on her audience. What was clear was that, by the early 1800s, she had planted her life firmly along the Blackwater River frontier, where isolation and lawlessness provided fertile soil for darker ambitions. Physically, Margaret Harker was a woman out of step with her time. Contemporary accounts, many preserved in fragmentary depositions and newspaper sketches, describe her as towering over most men. Nearly 6 feet tall, she carried herself with a posture of authority, her shoulders broad, her stride heavy, her hands calloused like those of a laborer. Her voice was deep, sometimes mistaken for that of a man when heard across a tavern. One witness later wrote that when she laughed, it was not the laugh of joy, but a hollow, booming crack that scattered all mirth around her. To many, this physicality alone was intimidating, but Margaret's true power lay in her personality. She possessed what neighbors described as an unyielding will. Even those who despised her admitted that she had a gift for commanding loyalty, or at least obedience. Men with reputations for violence or deceit found themselves deferring to her, drawn into her orbit by the force of her presence. She had the uncanny ability to read vulnerabilities, whether greed, fear, or desperation, and exploit them with cold precision. Her personal life was as shrouded as her past. She married a man named William Harker sometime around 1795, though records are scant. William was a small-time farmer, tending to tobacco and corn on a modest plot of land straddling the Virginia-North Carolina line. He was remembered as a quiet man, overshadowed by his wife's forceful character. By 1815, William was dead. Some whispered of poison, others of a sudden fever. Margaret wore her widowhood like armor, never remarrying, instead embracing the title that would define her legacy, the Widow Harker. It was after William's death that her true transformation began. No longer constrained by the expectations of marriage, she took sole command of the property. She expanded the farmhouse into a 2-story structure and, according to later testimony, oversaw the construction of hidden rooms, false walls, and subterranean chambers beneath the floorboards. To neighbors, it appeared she was simply enlarging her estate. In reality, she was constructing a labyrinth of concealment. The homestead soon became infamous for the way it seemed to swallow travelers. Teamsters heading south with goods sometimes stopped at her door for a meal and a bed, never to be seen again. Free black men and women passing through the region vanished near her lands. Traders spoke of wagons entering her yard under cover of darkness, their drivers never emerging again. Yet for years, nothing could be proven. Her property lay at the junction of 3 jurisdictions, and accusations evaporated as quickly as they surfaced. Descriptions of Margaret during this period depict her as increasingly domineering. A local preacher recalled her attending services with an expression that froze the congregation, and though she sat in silence, her gaze seemed to judge us more than any sermon. Children in surrounding farms were warned not to linger on the road near her homestead. Women crossing her path often lowered their heads, muttering prayers under their breath. The fear she inspired was not always logical, but it was pervasive. What made her all the more terrifying was her disregard for gender expectations. In an era when women were expected to be deferential, Margaret was confrontational. She cursed openly, carried a hunting knife on her belt, and was known to strike men in public if they insulted her. Her physical strength was legendary. One story tells of her hoisting a barrel of cider onto a wagon unaided, an act that left 3 farmhands staring in disbelief. Another account described her dragging a struggling hog across a muddy yard with one arm as if it were no heavier than a child. Her dominance extended beyond brute strength. Margaret cultivated a network of associates, men who worked as blacksmiths, ferrymen, or tavern keepers, all willing to turn blind eyes in exchange for coin. She used her tavern-like homestead as a meeting place, where whiskey flowed freely, deals were whispered, and plans were laid. By all appearances, it was an ordinary frontier gathering spot, yet beneath its floors, chained captives waited for their fate. The widow's reputation was complicated by her strange blend of charm and cruelty. To some, she could appear generous, offering food to poor families, providing lodging at little cost. But even these gestures were suspect, often veils for ulterior motives. Survivors later recounted how she lured victims with promises of employment, only for them to vanish once they accepted her hospitality. In her presence, charity and treachery were indistinguishable. Her widowed status became central to her image. Without a husband, she was free of patriarchal oversight, and this independence, though unusual, granted her both suspicion and fear. Male authorities were hesitant to confront her, perhaps embarrassed to admit that a woman commanded such criminal power. Others underestimated her entirely, believing her gender made her incapable of orchestrating violence. Margaret exploited these assumptions, cloaking her crimes behind the disbelief that a woman could mastermind such horrors. By the late 1820s, when whispers of disappearances became too numerous to ignore, her image had evolved into something almost supernatural. Farmers spoke of seeing her figure looming at dusk, a lantern swinging in her hand, her voice echoing across the swamps. A midwife recalled entering her home and hearing muffled cries from beneath the floorboards when she asked. Margaret claimed it was rats in the cellar. Even lawmen confessed unease in her presence, with one deputy later writing that she carried the air of one who had bargained with the devil himself. The excavation of bodies in 1831 confirmed what so many had feared, but dared not say aloud. Margaret Widow Harker had transformed her widowhood into dominion, her farm into a prison, and her reputation into a weapon. She was no longer just a woman living beyond the norms of society. She was a predator who thrived on fear, using her strength, her cunning, and her widow's veil to conceal a reign of terror that stretched across state lines. Her story was only beginning to unfold. The grisly discoveries in the field were but the prologue to a larger nightmare, one that revealed how the widow Harker had weaponized geography, lawlessness, and human greed to construct an empire built on blood. To understand how Margaret Harker's empire of terror flourished, one must look closely at the land that sheltered her. The border between Virginia and North Carolina in the early 19th century was not a neat line etched on a map, but a shifting, half-forgotten frontier of swamps, tangled forests, and scattered farms. It was, in many ways, a world apart, isolated, poorly governed, and ripe for exploitation by those willing to thrive in shadows. The landscape itself seemed designed to hide crime. Pine and oak forests stretched for miles, their trunks crowding the earth so tightly that little sunlight reached the ground. Beneath their branches, thickets of briar and holly made passage slow and treacherous. Beyond the woods lay expanses of marshland, where reeds and cypress trees rose from black water that stank of decay. Travelers who ventured into these wetlands without guidance risked being swallowed by mud or misled by the constant buzz of insects. To the uninitiated, the swamp was a labyrinth. To Harker, it was a fortress. The Blackwater River wound through the region like a dark artery. Its sluggish current carried silt and shadows alike, creating channels perfect for secret transport. Barges laden with tobacco or timber often drifted downstream in daylight, but at night, other cargo moved beneath the cover of mist. Locals told of boats passing silently at midnight, their lanterns extinguished, their passengers bound and gagged. Few spoke openly of these sightings, for to name them was to risk implication or worse, retribution. The roadways offered no greater sense of safety. In the 1820s, most were little more than cart tracks. Their surfaces rutted with mud and roots, horses labored heavily across them, wagons creaked and swayed, and travelers could take hours to cover a handful of miles. At the crossroads, taverns stood as the only relief, their smoky interiors providing food, drink, and temporary shelter. But these taverns were also nodes of rumor, barter, and betrayal. They were places where lawmen, outlaws, and ordinary farmers shared the same benches, never quite knowing who sat beside them. Johnson's Crossroads, later renamed Reliance to erase its reputation, was the most notorious of these meeting points. It was little more than a clearing where two tracks intersected, marked by a ramshackle tavern with warped beams and a sign so weather-beaten it was barely legible. To passing traders, it was a rest stop. To those in the know, it was the heart of a network where flesh itself was bartered. It was here, witnesses later claimed, that Harker found many of her accomplices, drawing men into her orbit with coin, whiskey, and intimidation. Jurisdictional confusion made this landscape a haven for criminals. The county lines of Virginia and North Carolina converged here, with Southampton County to the north and Hartford and Northampton counties to the south. Sheriffs and constables had authority only within their narrow boundaries. A fugitive could commit a crime in one county and, by crossing a single dirt road or river, slip beyond the reach of pursuit. Add to this the sheer remoteness of the region where farms lay miles apart, neighbors rarely visited, and communication traveled only as fast as a horse, and you had the perfect breeding ground for lawlessness. This was a time before professional police forces, before telegraphs, before coordinated federal oversight. News traveled slowly, often distorted by rumor. A disappearance in one county might never be connected to another disappearance just across the line. Families of the missing had little recourse but to search themselves or pray for answers. For free black communities, the risk was even greater. Their pleas were dismissed, their disappearances ignored, their freedom always precarious. The social fabric of the borderland reflected this fragility. The white population consisted largely of small tenant farmers and transient laborers, many of them seeking to escape debts or failed ventures elsewhere. Few had strong ties to the land or to each other. Trust was scarce, suspicion was common. In such a climate, silence became a form of survival. If wagons were heard at night, neighbors closed their shutters. If screams carried across the swamp, families whispered prayers but did not investigate. For free African Americans, the danger was suffocating. In theory, many in Virginia and North Carolina had secured their freedom through manumission or gradual emancipation. In practice, freedom was fragile, contingent on papers that could be lost, stolen, or dismissed by hostile authorities. At any moment, a free man or woman could be seized, their identity erased, their existence swallowed by the maw of slavery's markets in Georgia or Mississippi. The borderland was a place where liberty itself felt like a temporary loan. It is in this crucible of geography and lawlessness that Margaret Harker thrived. The swamps were her veil, the river her highway, the taverns her recruiting ground. She understood the weaknesses of jurisdictional lines better than any sheriff. She exploited the silence of fearful neighbors, the prejudice that rendered some lives invisible, and the terrain that swallowed wagons whole. Her property, situated exactly where the counties blurred, became both sanctuary and prison, a place where she could disappear her victims as easily as the land absorbed rainwater. The fear that pervaded the borderland was not irrational. Over time, the area acquired a reputation for strange happenings. Travelers swore they saw lanterns swinging in the forest where no path existed. Hunters reported stumbling upon shallow graves, quickly abandoned when they realized the soil contained not animal bones, but human remains. A midwife claimed she once delivered a child in a farmhouse near the crossroads and, on her way home, heard muffled cries from beneath Harker's floorboards. Yet none dared speak too loudly. In the borderland, survival meant silence. This silence was the widow's greatest ally. She did not need to threaten every neighbor or bribe every official. The land itself conspired in her favor, its swamps muffling cries, its roads discouraging pursuit, its laws tangling sheriffs in knots of jurisdiction. Even when suspicion rose, it dissipated like mist over the river, leaving no trail behind. By the 1820s, this region had become more than a backdrop. It was an accomplice. Every tree, every reed of the swamp, every shifting county line played its part in concealing what was happening within the widow's walls. And in that concealment, Margaret Harker built the foundations of her empire, an empire not of crops or cattle, but of stolen lives. The land itself had become her mask, and behind it, horrors were multiplying. The truth about Margaret Harker's origins was as slippery as the marshland she later ruled. In official records, she barely existed at all. Church registries contained no baptism under her name. County archives held no birth certificates, no formal lineage. To neighbors and distant kin alike, she was a woman who seemed to have appeared from nowhere emerging, as one old farmer recalled, like a shadow crossing the river. Some claimed she was born Lucretia Hanley in the final years of the 18th century, daughter of a New England cooper and his stern wife. Others swore she was Canadian, the child of loyalists who fled south after the American Revolution. Still, others insisted she was illegitimate, abandoned by a mother linked to one of the secretive sects that flourished on the northern fringes of the colonies. Whether by accident or design, Margaret herself encouraged these contradictions. When pressed, she would smile, tilt her head, and change the subject. Whichever tale held truth, there was agreement on one point from the beginning. She was different. Accounts from those who claim to have known her as a girl describe a child tall for her age, prone to long silences and sudden bursts of temper. She preferred solitude to playmates, wandering woods alone, collecting bones of animals and arranging them into patterns. A midwife in Connecticut later testified she had seen the girl chanting over a dead bird, murmuring words not of scripture but of something darker. She spoke as if she were coaxing it back to life. The woman said, by her teenage years, Margaret was rumored to have ties to a fringe sect that had broken away from mainstream Protestantism. In the decades after the Revolution, countless small religious groups proliferated across the young nation. Some preached radical visions of apocalypse. Others practiced secret rituals of purification and punishment. In the borderland between Connecticut and Rhode Island, one such sect, calling itself the Children of the New Zion, was said to practice ceremonies involving blood and symbolic burial. Margaret, according to scattered whispers, attended these gatherings. Whether she was a believer or merely a curious onlooker remains unknown, but the imagery of burial, confinement, and resurrection would echo chillingly in her later crimes. Around the age of 16, she vanished from New England records entirely. What happened in those years remains speculation. Some said she traveled with a band of itinerant healers, peddling herbal remedies and fortune-telling in exchange for shelter. Others believed she lived for a time with a cousin in Baltimore, where she may have learned the rougher ways of tavern keeping. Whatever the truth, by the dawn of the 19th century she reappeared hundreds of miles south, marrying a small farmer named William Harker in Virginia. Marriage, however, did little to tame her. William was remembered as soft-spoken, a man of modest means who raised corn and tobacco on marginal land. Yet it was Margaret who dominated the household. She managed the books, oversaw laborers, and dealt with traders. Neighbors later admitted that when they visited, it was Margaret who greeted them at the door. Margaret who bargained prices. Margaret whose voice carried across the fields. William faded into the background, so quiet that some wondered if he remained out of fear rather than love. Rumors swirled around his death in 1815. Officially, it was attributed to ague or swamp fever, a common affliction in the damp lowlands, but locals whispered of a slower poisoning. One farmhand recalled that William had grown pale and weak over months, his appetite gone, his body wasting. He would not allow a doctor near him, perhaps under his wife's command. When he died, Margaret showed no outward grief. She arranged a small burial, declined to wear mourning garb, and within weeks was seen conducting business as usual. The title of widow seemed to suit her more than that of wife. Freed from the constraints of matrimony, Margaret expanded her domain. She began purchasing adjacent parcels of land, often at suspiciously low prices. Families struggling with debt found her at their door with offers of coin or threats of eviction. Within a few years, she controlled one of the largest stretches of farmland in the area, its borders pressed up against the swamps and rivers that would become arteries of her hidden trade. But land was only part of her legacy. From this period onward, darker tales multiplied. A traveling Methodist preacher once claimed he had been invited to dine at her house. During the meal, Margaret spoke at length about sin and punishment, her voice rising until, in his words, she sounded more like a prophet of wrath than a woman of God. When he urged her toward repentance, she stared at him with a gaze so fierce he fled the house, never to return. Children in nearby farms told stories of strange lights flickering in her windows at midnight. Some claimed she held meetings in her parlor where chanting rose and fell, not in English but in an older, harsher tongue. A black servant who briefly worked in her home reported seeing marks carved into the beams of the cellar circles, crosses turned askew, and crude images of coffins. He fled after only 3 weeks, muttering that the widow keeps her prayers with the dead. What truly bound Margaret to the shadows of history, however, was the sense that she had inherited not just property but a philosophy that life could be taken, concealed, and traded as easily as livestock. In the early 1800s, as slavery expanded into the Deep South, she recognized the immense profits to be made from human misery. And unlike male traffickers who relied on brute force alone, Margaret possessed cunning, ruthlessness, and a network of silent allies. She would build an enterprise not merely on kidnapping, but on terror itself. The widow's murky past, her whispered ties to sex, her strange rituals, her sudden rise from obscurity fed the mythos that surrounded her. For some, she was merely a shrewd opportunist exploiting geography and prejudice. For others, she was something more a woman marked from birth, groomed in shadowy rites, whose crimes were not only economic but spiritual in nature. By the time the bodies were uncovered in 1831, these rumors fused with fact. The image of Margaret Harker as a towering widow who mixed religion, death, and profit was complete. She was not simply a criminal. She was, in the eyes of her community, the embodiment of evil carved into human form. And her transformation into one of the most feared figures of the 19th century was only beginning. The year 1808 marked a decisive turning point in America's dark history. That January, Congress officially banned the importation of enslaved Africans. The law was hailed by politicians as a moral victory, a symbolic gesture that distanced the young republic from the horrors of the transatlantic trade. But in practice, the demand for enslaved labor only grew. Cotton, fueled by Eli Whitney's gin, spread like wildfire across the Deep South. Fields in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia seemed endless, and planters clamored for workers to till the soil, pick the cotton, and drive the machinery of profit. The result was a brutal paradox. Though ships no longer carried chained captives from Africa's shores, the hunger for human bodies was more ravenous than ever. A healthy young man who might have sold for $300 in 1800 could now command over $1.200 by 1820. Children, too, had value, for they promised decades of labor and could be molded to plantation life. Every free black family in the North and border states became a target, their fragile liberty constantly under siege. This demand birthed what historians later called the Reverse Underground Railroad. While abolitionists worked tirelessly to guide enslaved people north to freedom, criminals devised a network that flowed in the opposite direction: free men, women, and children, stolen from their homes and forced southward into bondage. It was in this grim economy that Margaret Widow Harker saw opportunity not just to profit, but to rule. The widow was not the first to engage in kidnapping. By the early 1810s, gangs of men prowled rural Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, snatching people from isolated farms or luring them with promises of work. But Harker's approach was colder, more systematic. Where others relied on brute force, she devised a system of deception, concealment, and murder that turned her property into a hub of human trafficking. Her tavern-like homestead sat precisely where lawmen hesitated to tread. Positioned on the blurred line between Southampton County, Virginia, and Hartford County, North Carolina, it provided the perfect refuge for illicit activity. A victim seized in Virginia could be hidden across the line in North Carolina within hours, frustrating any pursuit. Similarly, captives taken in Carolina could be shifted back into Virginia territory whenever convenient. Jurisdictional boundaries meant to preserve order became her shield. Inside her home, hidden chambers multiplied. Witnesses who later described the property spoke of false walls, trapdoors leading to cellars, and underground rooms carved from the earth. In one chamber, iron rings were embedded in beams to fasten chains. In another, narrow ventilation shafts were disguised as cracks in the foundation, keeping air flowing to the captives while muffling their cries. Some said she forced black carpenters, themselves enslaved, to build these chambers under threat of death, ensuring their silence by killing them afterward. The widow's methods of capture were deceptively simple. Sometimes she posed as an employer, offering wages to young men in search of work. Sometimes she sent her accomplices ferrymen, blacksmiths, even children to lure unsuspecting victims with promises of opportunity in distant towns. Once inside her home, escape was nearly impossible. Victims were stripped of their free papers, beaten into silence, and stored in the darkness until a buyer was ready. Transporting captives south required cunning. Harker relied heavily on the Blackwater River, whose winding channels provided cover under moonless nights. Small flatboats, laden with goods on the surface, concealed human cargo below. In some cases, captives were shackled inside wagons and driven along hidden forest tracks toward larger roads, where accomplices posed as legitimate traders moving enslaved people lawfully. By the time these victims reached South Carolina or Georgia, their true identities had been erased. They were renamed, rebranded, and absorbed into the machinery of Southern slavery. But kidnapping alone did not satisfy Harker's appetite. Violence became integral to her enterprise. Rival traffickers who threatened her profits were invited to her tavern, plied with drink, and quietly murdered. Their bodies, like those of her victims, were boxed and buried in shallow graves. Traders carrying large sums of money became targets as well. If their disappearance raised suspicion, it hardly mattered. Local officials were often bribed, threatened, or indifferent. Few wished to stir trouble over the fate of men engaged in the same sordid trade. The profits were staggering. Contemporary reports suggest that a single group of captives, perhaps 10 in number, could fetch over $10,000 in the markets of New Orleans. With repeated shipments, Harker's network generated wealth rivaling that of legitimate planters. Unlike most farmers of her region, she did not struggle with debt or poor harvests. Her coffers were full, her barns well stocked, her household brimming with luxuries rare in frontier life. And yet, she lived not in ostentatious display but in grim functionality. The true riches she sought were power and fear. As her operations grew, so too did her reliance on a cadre of accomplices. Some were relatives by marriage sons-in-law who recognized the profits of her scheme. Others were drifters drawn by coin and whiskey, willing to dirty their hands for a share of the spoils. At least one was a free man of mixed race who served as a scout, able to move between communities unnoticed, identifying targets and luring them into traps. This diversity of conspirators was not accidental. It reflected Harker's shrewdness. She knew that success depended on infiltration as much as on brutality. The impact on surrounding communities was devastating. Free black families lived under constant dread, never certain whether a child walking to market would return. Mothers trained their children to carry their papers at all times, though even these documents could be torn or dismissed. Churches prayed openly for protection. Yet many quietly admitted that prayer was a frail shield against a woman like the widow, even among white settlers. Fear spread. The disappearances of traders and travelers raised eyebrows. Whispers began to circulate that the widow's tavern was cursed ground, that to cross her path was to gamble with life itself. But few dared confront her. She was, after all, a woman, and male authorities balked at the thought of charging a widow with crimes they associated with hardened gangs of men. Her gender, ironically, cloaked her in doubt and hesitation. By the late 1820s, Margaret Harker's name had become synonymous with terror. She had taken the loophole created by Congress's ban, twisted it into profit, and constructed a machinery of abduction that turned freedom itself into a fragile illusion. Her victims numbered not in dozens but in hundreds, and still the ground around her homestead swallowed their cries, the swamp drank their blood, and the borders shielded her from retribution. The land had given her opportunity, the law had given her cover, and her own cruelty had given her power. In that combination lay the foundation of one of America's most chilling criminal empires, a reign that would continue until the land itself, in 1831, began to give up the dead it had concealed for so long. The Widow Harker's crimes did not flourish by accident. They were the result of design deliberate, careful, and frighteningly systematic. By the mid-1820s, her property had become more than a home or farmstead. It was an apparatus of capture and concealment, a machine calibrated to transform human beings into commodities. At the center of this machinery stood her tavern, a place that to the casual traveler looked like a weary but honest stop on the road, but to those who knew better was a trap disguised as hospitality. From the outside, the tavern seemed ordinary enough. A weather-stained wooden sign hung above its door, etched with a crude carving of a lantern. Horses were tied to rails out front, and the smell of tobacco and fried corn cakes drifted from the chimney. A stranger arriving at dusk might see lanterns glowing in the windows, hear laughter inside, and feel a surge of relief at having found shelter in such a desolate land. That relief was precisely what Harker wanted. Inside, the tavern had two faces. By day, it functioned as a modest inn. The common room contained a long plank table, a battered hearth, and a bar stocked with cheap whiskey. Locals gathered here for drink, gossip, and games of cards. On the surface, it was indistinguishable from a dozen other frontier taverns. But beneath the floorboards lay a different reality. Trapdoors cleverly hidden beneath rugs opened to reveal ladders descending into darkness. The survivors later described the spaces below. They were narrow chambers dug into the clay, reinforced with timber, and lined with iron rings hammered into beams. Chains dangled from these rings, still rattling when the rooms were discovered years later. The ceilings were so low that captives could not stand upright, forcing them to crouch or crawl. Air came through small shafts that rose to ground level, disguised outside as innocent cracks or animal burrows. Light was nearly absent. For days, weeks, even months, men, women, and children endured this half-buried existence, hearing only the shuffle of footsteps above, the muffled laughter of the tavern, and the scrape of keys in the locks. Meals, when they came, were crude corn mush, dried meat, a dipper of water. Guards brought food in silence, offering no words, only blows if captives resisted. Waste was handled with buckets, rarely emptied, leaving the air fetid and suffocating. The psychological torment was often worse than the hunger. Some captives heard newcomers brought in, screaming, struggling, only to fall silent. Others recalled the sound of hammering above as coffins were prepared in advance. The widow used the tavern itself as bait. Travelers were encouraged to drink heavily. Strangers who boasted of money or carried goods too valuable to ignore were carefully marked. A nod from Harker to one of her accomplices was enough to set events in motion. A drugged cup, a sudden blow to the skull, a body dragged down the trapdoor. For free black travelers. The process was even more efficient. A forged promise of work, a sympathetic conversation, a place to sleep on the floor, then chains in the cellar by morning. Transportation southward was a crucial part of the operation. The Blackwater River, winding like a black ribbon through the forests and marshes, became Harker's highway. Flatboats concealed with tarps and barrels carried captives under moonless skies. On the surface, these boats appeared laden with timber or produce, but hidden compartments beneath held human cargo. The stillness of the river amplified every sound: the creak of ropes, the suppressed sobs of captives, the splash of poles pushing against the current. Yet, in the swamp's eternal chorus of frogs and cicadas, few, beyond the banks, ever heard. When boats were too risky, wagons provided another method. Heavy canvas was stretched over the tops, disguising captives as goods. Drivers posed as legitimate traders, their forged bills of sale convincing enough to fool most patrols. At crossroads taverns further south, contacts waited to receive the shipments, dispersing the captives into larger caravans bound for Charleston, Savannah, or New Orleans. Once delivered, identities were obliterated. Papers were destroyed, names changed, histories erased. Within weeks, a free man of Virginia became another nameless hand on a cotton plantation hundreds of miles away. What made Harker's system especially insidious was its efficiency. She did not rely solely on brute kidnapping. She wove her network into the very fabric of frontier life. Ferrymen, stable boys, and peddlers all were potential accomplices. Some acted out of greed, others out of fear. A ferryman who once refused her request was later found dead, his boat adrift in the reeds. Word spread quickly: cooperation meant coin. Defiance meant disappearance. Even children were not spared from her manipulations. Neighbors later testified that she sometimes sent her own relatives, orphans, and stepchildren into towns to act as decoys, befriending targets and leading them back to the tavern. The innocence of a child's face proved the perfect disguise. Once the victim stepped through Harker's door, the child vanished into the background, their role complete. Her tavern also functioned as a hub for criminal meetings. Men from across the Delmarva and Tidewater regions arrived under cover of night to negotiate. Deals were struck over whiskey, profits divided, routes mapped, beneath the candlelight. Harker presided like a matriarch, her booming voice settling disputes, her commanding presence brooking no dissent. Those who dared challenge her authority soon discovered that arguments ended in shallow graves. The murders, though shocking, were not random. They were strategic. Anyone who risked exposing her network, be it a rival traitor, an indiscreet accomplice, or even a child too frightened to keep silent, was eliminated. Bodies were boxed, buried in the fields, or sunk in the swamp. Some, witnesses later swore, were burned in hidden pits behind her house, the stench drifting for miles. She treated lives like firewood. One investigator later wrote, stacking them, consuming them, and leaving only ash. In this way, Harker's enterprise blurred the line between trafficking and serial murder. She was not merely a criminal profiting from human bondage. She was a predator who derived power from destruction itself. Every hidden room, every trapdoor, every flatboat gliding down the river testified to her mastery of concealment. What made her particularly dangerous was the way she exploited the community's complicity. Neighbors suspected, but silence protected them. Officials hinted at knowledge, but bribes or intimidation sealed their lips. Even those who despised her hesitated to speak. In a world where distance and lawlessness reigned, fear was the widow's most reliable accomplice. By the late 1820s, the widow's tavern had earned a reputation whispered across counties. To some, it was simply a place of drink and lodging. To others, it was a gateway to disappearance. Travelers who entered might never emerge. and beneath its creaking floorboards, in the stifling dark of its hidden chambers, human cargo awaited its midnight journey southward, destined for fields where their names and stories would be erased forever. This was the heart of Harker's empire, a false sanctuary, a tavern of shadows, where food and drink masked chains and coffins. It was not merely a building. It was a system of terror, woven into the land, the river, and the silence of a community too afraid or too willing to resist. The kidnappings alone would have marked Margaret Harker as a woman of infamy, but it was her murders that etched her name in the marrow of fear. Unlike other traffickers who relied on speed and concealment, the widow dealt with problems permanently. Anyone who jeopardized her enterprise, be they rival, witness, or helpless child, was silenced in ways that left even hardened criminals unsettled. Court depositions and oral testimonies gathered in the 1830s painted a portrait of murder as routine. Harker did not kill in fits of passion. She killed methodically, with calculation as cold as winter frost. Each life ended was not merely an act of violence, but a decision weighed, judged, and executed with chilling efficiency. One of the earliest stories came from a man named Elijah Carr, a drifter who had once worked as a stable hand near her tavern. According to his later confession, Carr had witnessed Harker invite a rival trader into her home under the guise of negotiation. The man, known only as Pritchard, had been moving captives south along routes that threatened to intersect with hers. He was described as boastful, carrying a purse heavy with gold. That night, Harker poured him drink after drink, her booming laugh echoing across the room. Hours later, Pritchard was gone. Carr claimed he helped dig the shallow pit where Pritchard's body was buried, though he dared not describe what had been done to him before he was silenced. Her eyes never blinked. Carr said, "She struck like she was hammering a nail." Children were not spared. Survivors whispered of infants born in captivity who disappeared within days. One young woman later testified that she gave birth while chained beneath the tavern. The child, weak and feverish, cried incessantly in the dark. Harker descended the ladder one night, her apron spread wide. She gathered the infant into her arms. She said she'd carry it to the doctor, the mother recounted, but the child never came back. Neighbors would later claim they saw a small bundle carried to the swamp that evening, swallowed by mist and silence. There were other children, two older ones, kidnapped with their parents or lured with promises of work. These children, less easily silenced, became dangerous liabilities. One boy, no more than 10, was remembered for screaming constantly in the cellar, after days of failed attempts to quiet him. Harker descended with a wooden club. Witnesses swore they heard 2 sharp blows and then only silence. The boy's body was later identified among the skeletal remains uncovered in 1831, his skull fractured, his bones stuffed into a wooden chest built for a smaller form. Even her own accomplices learned that loyalty offered no protection. A ferryman named Isaac Norton, who had once transported captives down the Blackwater, grew uneasy and threatened to speak to authorities. Within a week, he vanished. His boat was later found drifting, his belongings still aboard. Locals whispered that the widow herself had lured him to the tavern for a final supper, after which he was never seen again. To those who worked for her, the message was unmistakable betrayal meant burial. Some murders were driven by paranoia rather than necessity. As the 1820s drew to a close and whispers of investigation spread, Harker grew increasingly ruthless. She began to see potential threats everywhere. A serving girl dismissed for clumsiness was rumored to have been poisoned. A peddler who stayed one night too many was said to have disappeared after asking too many questions about the locked cellars. Even her neighbors lived under suspicion. When one farmer questioned why so many wagons passed her property at night, his barn mysteriously burned to the ground. Her violence bore an almost ritual quality. Survivors described how she prepared the burial chests herself, their dimensions carefully measured. Some swore she muttered prayers over the dead, invoking not Christian salvation but something harsher, older. Whether these were remnants of the sex she had known in youth or inventions of her own mind, they added a layer of dread to her killings. She spoke as if she was sending them somewhere. One former accomplice testified, not just killing but condemning. The brutality extended beyond human victims. Investigators in 1831 noted the number of animal bones scattered across her property: dogs, hogs, even horses. Some bore signs of blunt trauma, as if killed not for food but for rage or practice. It seemed as though violence was woven into every part of her existence, a grim rehearsal that culminated in the deaths of her captives. What struck contemporaries most was her lack of remorse. Even when confronted with evidence, she displayed no sorrow, no trembling. To her, murder was a tool, no different than a hammer or a chain. Children were killed to silence their cries. Rivals were eliminated to secure her profits. Witnesses were erased to protect her secrets. Each killing was a transaction, a ledger balanced with blood. Yet the murders also served another purpose. They reinforced the aura of terror that shielded her from exposure. Neighbors may have suspected her crimes, but who would dare testify when they knew the widow buried dissenters as readily as strangers? Her violence created a silence heavier than law itself. By the time her network reached its height, the ground surrounding her tavern had become a cemetery of secrets. Wooden chests buried beneath orchards, shallow graves near the swamp, bones scattered in ash pits. Each body told a story of opportunity snuffed out, of a future erased. And yet, to the widow, they were not tragedies but necessities. Her reign of murder blurred lines that others still recognized. Slave traders trafficked in misery but hesitated at killing valuable cargo. Bandits robbed travelers but rarely slaughtered indiscriminately. Harker, however, had no such boundaries. Profit, paranoia, and cruelty fused into one relentless practice. She was not simply participating in the reverse Underground Railroad. She was its butcher, its executioner, its dark priestess. By the late 1820s, whispers of her crimes reached beyond the borderland. In Philadelphia, missing persons were traced southward, many last seen near her crossroads. In Richmond, rumors of her tavern as a house of disappearance circulated in back rooms. Still, for years, nothing was done. She thrived in that silence, burying more bodies beneath her soil, silencing more voices with her club, and feeding her empire on fear. The murders were not collateral damage, they were the core of her dominion. And the land, the river, and the fearful silence of her neighbors bore witness to everyone. Every empire of cruelty eventually produces a witness, a survivor who carries within them the story that can undo their oppressor. For Margaret, Widow Harker, that witness was a boy named Thomas Gray, though some records later referred to him only as the mulatto lad. His presence in the widow's household was long regarded as a curiosity, a boy who seemed neither entirely servant nor entirely free. But in truth, Thomas was both victim and accomplice, trapped in a role that scarred his conscience and ultimately shaped his destiny. Thomas was said to have been purchased by Harker around 1818 when he was no older than 7. Accounts differ. Some claim he had been the child of a free black woman and a white laborer in Norfolk. Others insist he had been orphaned in Philadelphia and sold under false papers. Whatever his origin, the boy found himself in the widow's possession, absorbed into her household not merely as a servant but as a tool. She clothed him, fed him, and, when outsiders were present, presented him as a kind of ward. But beneath this veneer lay a reality of chains and terror. At first, Thomas performed simple tasks, tending the hearth, grooming horses, carrying messages, but as he grew older, the widow pressed him into darker service. His mixed heritage made him uniquely valuable to her schemes. With skin light enough to pass among white communities but features that allowed him to move among free black families, he became a chameleon. She trained him to act the part required, sometimes a runaway seeking refuge, sometimes a friendly errand boy, sometimes a promising worker looking for companions to join him on a new opportunity. Neighbors later testified that they often saw Thomas walking with strangers, young men and women who disappeared soon after. He smiled easily, one witness recalled, and folk trusted him. Who would not trust a boy? It was precisely this trust that made him dangerous. Under the widow's command, Thomas lured victims into her tavern, assuring them of work, shelter, or safe passage. By the time they realized the deception, the trapdoor had closed above their heads, but the boy was not blind to what followed. Harker, calculating as ever, ensured Thomas saw enough of her cruelty to bind him with fear. He helped deliver food to captives chained in the cellar, watching as they withered in darkness. He stood at her side when she berated her accomplices, her voice booming through the tavern, and, most haunting of all, he sometimes witnessed her murders. In a deposition taken years later, Thomas described seeing her lift a wounded child in her apron and vanish into the swamp. "I never saw the child again," he confessed, "but I heard the splash of water and knew what it meant." This dual role, both participant and victim, tore at Thomas as he grew. He was beaten when he resisted, threatened with sale to the brutal cotton fields if he disobeyed. At times, the widow offered strange, twisted kindness. She gave him better food than other servants, allowed him to sit near the fire, spoke to him in tones almost maternal. Yet this favor was itself a weapon, forging dependency. She convinced him that survival depended entirely on her. "You belong to me," she reportedly told him. "Without me, you would be nothing but a dead dog in the road." By the mid-1820s, Thomas was in his teens. His tasks grew heavier. He was made to drive wagons, to carry ropes and chains, even to dig graves. He claimed he once helped lower a wooden chest into the soil, knowing a human body lay inside. "I felt the weight," he later told authorities, "and I felt my soul grow heavier with it." But fear kept him silent. To betray her was to invite death. And yet, something within him began to resist. Perhaps it was the memory of his mother, whose face he claimed to see in dreams. Perhaps it was the horror of watching children, not much younger than he once had been, vanish into darkness. Or perhaps it was simple survival instinct, the knowledge that eventually the widow's paranoia might turn on him as it had on so many others. The breaking point came in 1829, the year the graves were uncovered. By then, Thomas had grown into a wiry young man of 18. He sensed suspicion turning toward him. Some accomplices muttered that he might betray them. Harker herself grew harsher, accusing him of disloyalty. When he attempted to flee, he was captured and chained in the cellar he had once guarded. For days he lay in the darkness, listening to the muffled cries of new captives. He believed his execution was imminent. Instead, fate intervened. Authorities, already probing into disappearances, raided the widow's property. Thomas was dragged out with the others, his wrists raw, his body thin. But unlike the others, he carried knowledge that could expose everything. Faced with a choice between silence and survival, he chose survival. In sworn testimony, Thomas described the hidden chambers beneath the tavern, the routes along the Blackwater River, the murders of rivals and children alike. He led investigators to burial sites, pointing out where bodies had been interred. He recounted the methods of luring victims, the forged promises of work, the shackled journeys south. His words painted a picture of horror so vast that even seasoned lawmen were shaken. Yet his testimony was more than accusation, it was confession. He admitted his own role, his own deceptions, his complicity in leading innocents into chains. He did not absolve himself, though he pleaded that he had acted under duress, bound by fear of death. The court, recognizing both his guilt and his value as a witness, granted him clemency. Without him, much of the widow's empire might have remained buried in silence. Thomas Gray's story remains one of tragic complexity. He was both weapon and victim, both betrayer and savior. His childhood had been stolen, his innocence twisted into a tool of crime. Yet in the end, he broke free, choosing to expose the horrors that had defined his youth. Some reports claim he later moved north under a new name, perhaps aided by abolitionists who saw in him not a criminal but a survivor. Others insist he never escaped the shadows, living out his days haunted by ghosts of the cellar. What is certain is this: without Thomas Gray, the Widow Harker's reign might have endured longer, her graves undisturbed, her crimes lost to rumor. It was the testimony of a boy who had seen too much, endured too much, that pulled her empire into the light. And with his words, the noose of justice began to tighten. When Thomas Gray began to speak, the facade that had shielded the Widow Harker for decades began to fracture. His testimony was not a collection of vague rumors, but a detailed map of horror. He described burial sites, secret rooms, hidden compartments, and even the names of accomplices. For the first time, authorities possessed a blueprint of the widow's empire, and they acted with a swiftness unusual for the time, recognizing that her crimes had spilled across county and even state boundaries. The year was 1829 in Southampton County, Virginia. Sheriff Nathaniel Redford convened an unprecedented coalition of lawmen. Constables from North Carolina rode north to join him, while representatives from the governor's office in Richmond urged immediate action. Reports were carried as far as Washington, D.C., where officials alarmed by rumors of hundreds of missing free blacks agreed that something resembling a federal response was necessary. This level of coordination was rare in the early 19th century, but the magnitude of Harker's crimes demanded it. Search warrants were issued, their language broad enough to allow investigators to pry into every corner of her property. With shovels, picks, and wary determination, they descended on the widow's farmstead. What they uncovered would shake the region to its core. The first grave lay in a low-lying orchard behind the tavern, guided by Thomas's directions. Investigators dug only a few feet before their shovels struck wood. A box was unearthed, its timbers warped by dampness but still intact. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a young child. The skull was fractured, one arm twisted unnaturally across the chest. A hush fell over the men as they lifted the bones into the light. Some turned away. Others crossed themselves. The sheriff recorded the moment in his ledger: a child, no more than 8, laid in a box as if where. More graves followed. In a patch of marshy ground near the riverbank, 3 wooden chests were found within yards of each other. One contained the remains of an adult male, chains still clasped around his wrists. Another held the bones of a woman, her jaw broken. The third contained 2 bodies crammed together, their legs entangled, as though they had been forced inside alive. Witnesses swore that the stench rising from the soil lingered for days, a reminder of lives extinguished and forgotten. In total, at least 12 sets of remains were uncovered during those first weeks, but Thomas Gray insisted the true number was far greater. He led investigators to pits now overgrown with weeds, to cellar walls where dried stains still darkened the wood, to swamps where he claimed bodies had been weighted with stones and dropped into black water. Some of these sites yielded nothing, whether because the remains had sunk too deep or because scavengers had scattered them. But enough evidence emerged to confirm his words: the widow's land was a graveyard. The discoveries electrified the public. Newspapers from Richmond to Philadelphia carried sensational headlines: female fiend exposed in Virginia, and house of murder on the Blackwater River. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse in Southampton, demanding justice. Some came to gawk, others to mourn, still others to confirm that the woman who had haunted their whispers was finally brought low. For free black communities in Virginia and beyond, the revelations confirmed their deepest fears. Families who had long wondered about missing sons or daughters now saw their suspicions vindicated. But the investigation did not stop at the tavern. Encouraged by Gray's testimony, officials expanded their search to properties linked to Harker's associates. In Hartford County, North Carolina, a small barn yielded a hidden chamber containing shackles and scraps of clothing. In Northampton County, an abandoned ferry house revealed bones buried beneath the hearthstone. Each discovery extended the network, proving that the widow had not acted alone but had orchestrated a sprawling conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Sheriff Redford's notes cataloged the findings with grim precision. April 17, 1829, child's bones. Orchard behind tavern. April 19, 1829, adult male. Chains on wrists, buried near riverbank. April 21, 1829, box containing 2 skeletons. Sex indeterminate. April 23, 1829, fragments of clothing, buttons, and human teeth. Cellar pit beneath tavern floor. Each entry was a nail in the widow's coffin. The broader implications of the case unsettled authorities in Washington. This was not an isolated murder spree. It was an organized system of human trafficking that had operated across state lines for years, perhaps decades. The realization forced politicians to confront an uncomfortable truth, while abolitionists celebrated the Underground Railroad. There existed a darker mirror image, one just as organized and far more profitable. The widow Harker had built her fortune not in spite of the system of slavery, but because of it. She had exploited its loopholes, its prejudices, and its silences to enrich herself while destroying countless lives. Public outrage grew. Petitions circulated in Philadelphia and Baltimore demanding harsher penalties for kidnappers. Abolitionist newspapers seized on the case, declaring it proof that slavery corrupted everything it touched, turning even widows into monsters. Pro-slavery voices, and embarrassed by the scandal, attempted to downplay her crimes, insisting she was an anomaly. But the evidence was undeniable. Meanwhile, the widow herself sat in a stone cell in Southampton's jail, awaiting trial. Contemporary accounts describe her as unrepentant. Guards noted that she ate heartily, spoke confidently, and even laughed when told of the graves uncovered on her land. "I have buried more than they'll ever find," she allegedly boasted to one jailer. Whether true or bravado, the words chilled those who heard them. The legal case against her was formidable. She faced multiple indictments for murder, each carrying the death penalty. Witnesses lined up survivors like Thomas Gray. Neighbors emboldened now that her power had collapsed. Accomplices eager to save themselves by testifying. The Attorney General of Virginia declared it a case that shall test whether the law binds all citizens, even those whose crimes have long been hidden by fear. And yet, as the trial approached, unease lingered. Could a woman, even one as monstrous as Harker, truly face the gallows in a society that so rarely punished women with death would her gender, once her shield, again soften the judgment of the courts? Some suspected she might escape with imprisonment. Others feared she might evade justice entirely. But those questions would never be answered in the courtroom. For even as authorities prepared their case, the widow Harker was preparing her own escape, one not through flight or acquittal, but through the poison she kept hidden in her cell. By the spring of 1831, Margaret Widow Harker was at last caged. She sat behind iron bars in Southampton County Jail, awaiting what promised to be the most sensational trial in Virginia's history. The evidence against her was overwhelming: the graves, the bones, the testimonies of neighbors and accomplices, and, above all, the damning words of Thomas Gray. Even the most seasoned lawyers admitted that her conviction was all but certain. The gallows loomed over her future. Yet the widow remained unbowed. Guards reported that she carried herself with the same imperious air that had once cowed her neighbors. She ate with appetite, demanded extra blankets, and scoffed at the ministers who came to offer her salvation. When one clergyman urged her to repent for the lives she had taken, she leaned forward, eyes gleaming, and whispered, "Do you think repentance digs up bones?" Her lack of remorse disturbed even her jailers. One deputy wrote that she spoke of her murders as though they were mere business transactions. She spoke of children like they were lambs slaughtered for winter. He recorded. And when I recoiled, she laughed. For decades, she had been feared in silence. Now, exposed, she embraced her infamy. Preparations for her trial proceeded quickly. A grand jury indicted her on multiple counts of murder, each tied to specific victims whose remains had been exhumed. The trial promised to draw spectators from across Virginia and beyond. Newspapers from Baltimore and Philadelphia sent correspondents. Abolitionist groups hoped the proceedings would shine a light on the larger horrors of the reverse Underground Railroad. Slave traders, embarrassed by the exposure, watched nervously, knowing her testimony might reveal their complicity. But Margaret Harker had no intention of mounting a defense. She seemed to know the law would not save her. Instead, she sought to control her fate in the only way left, by denying the courts the satisfaction of passing sentence. On the night of May 9th, 1831, jailers discovered her lying on the floor of her cell, her lips stained, her breath shallow. By dawn, she was dead. Hidden in her clothing, they found a small vial, its contents traced to arsenic. How she obtained the poison remains a mystery. Some speculated that a sympathizer smuggled it in, bribed by her remaining coin. Others believed she had hoarded it for months, planning her final act even before her arrest. Whatever the means, the result was the same. The widow had cheated the hangman. News of her death spread like wildfire. For some, it was a relief, the end of a reign of terror, the silencing of a monster who had haunted their lives. For others, it was a bitter disappointment. Families of victims had hoped to see her stand in court, to hear her crimes named aloud, to watch justice delivered on the scaffold. Instead, she slipped away on her own terms, denying them closure. She stole even her own punishment. One grieving father wrote to a newspaper, "Her burial was hasty and unceremonious." Authorities interred her body in the potter's field beside the jail, a grave marked by no stone. Yet her story did not end there. Rumors circulated that her skull had been separated from her body and kept as a morbid curiosity, passed between private collections and, decades later, displayed briefly in a small-town library. Whether true or not, the tale reflected the enduring fascination with the woman who had turned widowhood into a cloak of terror. In the aftermath of her death, investigators struggled to dismantle what remained of her network. Some accomplices fled south, vanishing into the slave markets of Mississippi and Louisiana. Others were captured and tried, though few received sentences as harsh as their crimes warranted. Thomas Gray, the boy whose testimony had brought the truth to light, was granted freedom and protection, though he carried the weight of complicity all his life. Some accounts suggest he later aided the Underground Railroad, a small attempt to balance the horrors of his youth. Historians estimate that Harker's gang may have trafficked hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 free black men, women, and children into slavery. The profits measured in tens of thousands of dollars, a fortune by the standards of the time. But the true cost was immeasurable, families broken, names erased, generations condemned to bondage. Her crimes also forced a reckoning. The case revealed not only the brutality of one woman, but the systemic failures of an entire society. Harker thrived because laws were fragmented, because neighbors remained silent, because the lives of free blacks were deemed expendable. She operated for nearly 20 years, not in secret, but in plain sight, shielded by indifference and prejudice. The land around her tavern bore scars long after her death. Locals avoided it, whispering of ghosts in the orchard, of cries echoing from the swamp at night. The community eventually renamed Johnson's Crossroads Reliance, an effort to erase the stain of its past. But memories could not be buried so easily. Parents still warned children not to stray too far, invoking the widow's name as a cautionary tale. Today, the story of Margaret Harker stands as one of America's darkest parables. She was a woman who defied the expectations of her gender not in pursuit of freedom or dignity, but in pursuit of domination and profit. She twisted widowhood into a mantle of power, turning her home into a slaughterhouse and her river into a highway of despair. Her legacy is not one of fascination, but of warning. She reminds us how cruelty can fester in silence, how prejudice can cloak atrocity, how human beings can be reduced to ledgers and coffins when society refuses to see them as equal. For every victim whose bones were unearthed, countless more vanished into the deep South, their names forgotten, their stories untold. The widow Harker may have taken her secrets to the grave, but the soil she tainted still whispers. It whispers of chains in cellars, of boats drifting at midnight, of children carried in aprons and never returned. It whispers that beneath the fabric of American history lies another story, one written not in ink but in blood and silence. And that story of the widow who fed on fear and built an empire on bones must never be forgotten.